Okay, this is part 8, the Synagogue of Satan, Footprints in History. I just wanted to go over some of the religious groups and sects after the Jewish revolt of 66 A.D. and go over some of their philosophies and beliefs. I'm not any expert in philosophy, but I'll go over some of the ideas that were borrowed from the Gentile world, mostly from the Greeks. The Jews had been trying to understand the Bible with Greek ideas for many centuries, and they were also trying to convert the Gentiles using their own ideas. And many Jews were very learned in Greek philosophy and Gentile beliefs, one of the most important was Philo of Alexandria, and also the Apostle Paul was very learned in Greek culture and thought, so he was also able to use that to convert Gentiles. Philo almost certainly believed that the Bible was just allegorical and could easily be explained with Greek philosophy. He was connected to the Stoic school and was very learned in the teachings of Plato. He appeared to be connected to the Therapeutae, the trade guild or society that was connected to the medical guild of Asclepius in Pergamum. The Therapeutae combined Greek philosophy with ancient rites of Egyptian priests. Greek philosophers had been coming to Egypt for centuries. They would study at the city of Heliopolis, which is also known as On or Avon or Beth Shemesh in the Bible. The Essenes were also somewhat connected to the cult of Asclepius and the Therapeutae. So, since many members of the ruling families of Jerusalem, Judea, and Israel were no doubt connected to the Essenes, they were then connected to the cult of Asclepius and the Therapeutae. The Essenes were sometimes known as Ebionites. They may have been just a branch of the Essenes. Many of Jesus' immediate family and many other Jews may have been Ebionites. The Ebionites believed Jesus was the Messiah, but they didn't accept the virgin birth and also that he was divine. It's very interesting that the doctrines of the virgin birth, the divinity of Jesus, and also the Lord's Supper were also very offensive to Romans. They believed that that was cannibalism and also incest, and for this reason many Christians were persecuted. There are records that Emperor Vespasian, after the Jewish revolt, wanted to hunt down ruling families of Jerusalem and Judea, even the family of Jesus himself. He wanted to cut out their family line. They were considered a threat to the Roman Empire. Vespasian may not have persecuted Christians at first, and also he may have allowed the synagogues to keep operating because he thought they had good information on some of the immediate family of Jesus and also members of the ruling families of Jerusalem and Judea, and they might give him information on how he could track them or keep them under control or eliminate them. There's evidence that the Emperor Domitian had James, the son of Jude, the brother of Jesus, killed for this reason. This may be why the Emperor Trajan, a few years later, also had a policy of not actively seeking out Christians for persecution, but he would give his governors discretion, and they would usually only persecute Christians if they were repeatedly accused of Christian practices, and they might have been also using Jews for accusations against Christians in something that was called Jewish jealousy. And they may have been doing this to find important Christians or important Jews that they were trying to track or eliminate. Many of the zealots were believed to be related to some of the royal families, even including some of the family of Jesus. So the Roman Empire wanted to hunt them down, and they would take refuge in secret societies and also with the Essenes. And that may be why the Essenes eventually disappeared, because of their connection to members of the ruling families and to the zealots. Some scholars will claim that it was the Christian church itself that wanted to change the records of Jesus' family and the ruling families of Israel, and they wanted to replace it with a falsified Jesus, an allegorical type Jesus that would justify the Roman Catholic Church. But again, there's evidence that it was actually Vespasian and his ruling family and ruling families of Rome that wanted to cut off the ruling bloodlines of Israel. All those related by blood to the ruling house of David, Solomon, and Jesus were known by the name of Nazarene or Nazarene because they were a branch of the ruling bloodline. And the immediate family of Jesus were known by the name of Desposyni, and that name just means belongs to the Lord or heirs of the Lord. Many of these related families would flee from the Romans as far as Arabia, Persia, Egypt, and from Egypt even as far as Ireland to escape the power of the Romans that were hunting them down. Even some early Christians may have gone as far as Ireland to escape the Romans, along with some of the ruling families and family of Jesus. Before he put down the Jewish revolt, Vespasian was known to be active in Britain to fight against Druids, and it may be that the Druids were harboring early Christians and others escaping the Romans at that time. But a lot of these ruling families were mixed and were not even completely Israelite. And one might ask, what happened to Herod's family after the Jewish revolt? They seemed to disappear, and also the Maccabees and the Hasmonean dynasty. And it may be that the Roman families were not just trying to kill them off, but trying to intermarry with them to increase their connection to Israel and other countries. Julius Caesar had a child with Cleopatra, and that was probably to increase his hold on Egypt. Not all of Jesus' immediate family may have been Christians. According to Christian tradition, Jesus' brother James and his brother Jude wrote some of the New Testament, and James was known to lead the church at Jerusalem. He was known as James the Just, but there may have been other members of his family that didn't accept Christianity. Like the Ebionites, they may have believed that Jesus was a Messiah, but actually all the rulers of Israel were considered messiahs, so there was nothing especially important about that. But many of the leaders in the Jewish revolt claimed to be Messiah, and they actually caused a big problem for the Jews. All they did was create a division that the Romans were able to capitalize on. And some of the so-called Messiahs also believed that they were divine. Bar Kokhba revolted supposedly against Hadrian when Hadrian had wanted to rename Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina, and also there was a belief that Hadrian wanted to put a temple of Jupiter on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But the name of Bar Kokhba is actually not his real name. Bar Kokhba is just a title. It means son of a star. Kokhba means star. So that has a divine overtone, and that could also be seen as something like Jesus had done. And it's interesting why the Jews went with Bar Kokhba, or some of the Jews, but they rejected Jesus for a similar thing. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, Jews were barred from Jerusalem and most of Palestine. Palestine was a new name given to the land of Israel by the Romans, possibly out of spite for the Jewish revolt. And many Jews would be expelled to southern Gaul, where they would join other Jews that had been taken captive there as far back as Pompey's conquest in 63 BC. And other Jews would join the Jews in the dispersion across the Roman Empire. About this time there was a rise in many sects that caused a growing division between the Jews and the Christians, and there was a divide that was rejected by many early Christian leaders between what was called antinomianism, which just means anti-law or against law, and asceticism. Asceticism was a belief that to get closer to God, one had to abstain from as many fleshly, physical experiences as possible. And the anti-law group believed that one didn't even have to keep the law and could practice anything and could still approach God with their fleshly practices. There was also further schism over a faction that was known as Judaizers. Judaizers could be considered Christians, but they were denounced by the main Christian church because they believed that Gentiles had to practice Jewish law to be considered part of the Jews. A group called the Marcionites had a radical animosity toward the Judaizers, and they came up with a belief that was actually rejected by other Christians and also even other Gnostics that weren't necessarily Christians. The Marcionites did not recognize the Old Testament. They only recognized the New Testament, and they actually taught that the God of the Old Testament was not the same as the God and the Father of Jesus. And they believed that the God of the Old Testament was actually a lower spirit they called the demiurge that created the physical world but had no connection to spirit, and that the Father of Jesus was a higher spirit that had no connection to the physical world. The Marcionites had another belief that became known as Docetism, and that was that Jesus only appeared to come in a physical body but was actually only a spirit, and that he didn't actually suffer on the cross. And this belief was actually rejected by many Christians and also other Gnostics who held that the Marcionite beliefs were not really even Gnostic. There is evidence that many early Christian leaders didn't reject Gnostic ideas themselves, but they disapproved when the ideas were being worshipped in a form of idolatry, and they also didn't approve when the ideas were taken out of context and were considered a higher truth than the ultimate truth they believed was in Jesus. And they also rejected what they called a false Gnosticism. Gnosticism really only just meant science, and they believed that there were many ideas that were posing as science but were really witchcraft or superstition. It's fairly clear even in the Bible that many early Christian leaders rejected asceticism. They believed that asceticism was only concerned with overcoming the flesh, but the Christians believed that Jesus also overcame death, and the ascetics were only worshiping fleshly discipline and not Jesus. And the ascetics had a similar belief to the Marcionites. The ascetics, or many of the ascetics, believed that the God of the Bible was pure spirit, and that it was actually a lower spirit that created the physical world, and the physical world was evil. And to overcome it and to approach pure spirit, one had to abstain from all fleshly or physical desires. And it's fairly certain that most early Christian leaders rejected that also. Now at the other end of the spectrum were the antinomian factions, and they were best represented by the Carpocratians of Egypt. They were named after their leader Carpocrates, and they didn't believe in any requirement for keeping the law. They actually believed in what they called good and evil works. They could do anything, and they actually were committed to doing good and evil and living what they called a full life. And they would do this to transcend to the highest heaven or spirit. And they believed Jesus had done this also. They may have operated out of a large Jewish temple at Leontopolis near Alexandria, Egypt. This temple had been created by priests that had been expelled from Jerusalem many centuries before, at the time of the Maccabees. They appear to have controlled most of the trade guilds, especially in Egypt, through their depository of knowledge, which included knowledge of trades, crafts, and arts, and they also boasted that they had knowledge of angelic beings and occult knowledge of sorcery and witchcraft. The Carpocratians were rejected and denounced by the early Christian leader Clement of Alexandria. They were said to boast that they possessed all knowledge, both angelic and earthly, and knowledge of what was called the deep things of Satan. And this is probably what is referred to in the New Testament, and in the New Testament that may have been referring to the Carpocratians, and they also may have been who were being denounced in the book of Jude in the New Testament. Many of these sects were said to be ruled by the Desposyni, and that the ruling office would be passed down by bloodline, but it may be that the leaders were a mixture of different ruling families and powerful individuals. And many of them wanted to break free from Roman control and establish their own control over the Roman Empire from Jerusalem. And over time, they would increasingly be at odds with both the Roman Empire and the Christian Church. So in the next part, I'll go over some more of the factional disputes and the struggles with the Christians and the Jews, and also with the Roman Empire and the Christian Church. See you then.